So thank you. Thank you for all your patience and your ability to stick through 8 talks in a row. Let me first say that my project was funded by NIJ, and for those of you who are congressional staff, I just can't say enough what a great bang for the buck I think the federal taxpayers are getting out of NIJ research. Obviously, I'm biased because I've benefited from it. But I think if you're looking for, sometimes research is a tough sell on the Hill. But if you're looking for research about problems that are affecting all of our communities across the country, so this isn't a regional issue, and this isn't research, basic research, which is of course very valuable. I come from a university. I have to acknowledge basic research. But if you're interested in research that affects things that are happening right today, I think you've seen the evidence of that, and that is the stuff that NIJ is doing with hundreds of projects every year. So please think about that. My topic is on use of community policing techniques and strategies. It piggybacks very nicely from our prior talk on use of community policings for other purposes, but mine is to deal with violent extremism. So it juxtaposes with Laura's presentation as well. But I think, just pointing this out, my research is very qualitative, talking to people, interviews, and Laura's is really incredibly data-driven. So that's also the diversity of research that you're seeing coming through these various programs. My question was, how can we use these community policing strategies to address the problem of violent extremism in our communities? And I believe that these techniques and these strategies are equally applicable to all different forms of extremism, whether it be extremism inspired by Al-Qaeda and ISIS, extremists inspired by right-wing ideologies or anti-government or others. My particular project looked specifically at Al-Qaeda and ISIS-related extremism and the interactions between Muslim American communities and police. And we were trying to identify what were the challenges, what were the threshold problems that made it difficult to possibly implement these kinds of strategies, and talking to police departments and across the country, what were the best practices, promising practices that we thought would be helpful for police departments who were at the nascent stage or interested in trying to build relations with their communities directed at trying to prevent violent extremism. What would those be? And actually, before I get any further, I also want to piggyback on, I think it was Thomas's presentation earlier, just to talk about what the magnitude of this problem is. You saw the statistic that 43 homicides per day. If you look at over 15 years of violent extremist incidents inspired by Al-Qaeda and ISIS, by Muslim Americans, and actually our data even includes John Allen Muhammad, who was really more of a black nationalist than he was, but he was Muslim. So we put him in the database so we don't get accused of fudging the data. The number of homicides attributable to this form of violence over 15 years, post 9/11, is essentially a long weekend of violence in America. So 15 years, the violence attributed to this particular problem is a Memorial Day weekend. Now, you can ask yourself, do we overemphasize that or not? I just want to put it in that context. I think it's important anyway, or if it wasn't, I'd be out of business, right? So our core finding for this project is this, and I think this piggybacks very nicely with the other study, is that building trust with the community is the core issue. And if you can't build trust, doesn't matter how great your police chief is, doesn't matter how receptive your community is, doesn't matter how wonderful your programs are, if you can't build trust between a community and the police department, then you're not going to have success in trying to use these techniques to try to lower the likelihood of this very unlikely problem in communities around America. However, once trust is established, this relationship between the community and the police department can be so fundamental in addressing both violent extremism, but also a whole other range of public safety concerns for the community. This can be a real a window into building more harmonious communities and addressing a variety of different problems. Let me just briefly say what the challenges are for using these techniques to address this problem, especially with Muslim American communities, and then a core idea about what some of the best practices are. First, on the challenges. We are dealing in America right now with a Muslim American community that I would say, and I don't take this word lightly, and I'm also not a public health person, but is experiencing a form of trauma that you have to take into account when you're saying, okay, interact with the police, tell us about suspicious incidents. The level of fear, the level of concern about do these communities feel they have a place in America, if you look at the rhetoric around the campaign, if you look at the number of mosque vandalisms, if you look, and I'm from Chapel Hill, I had 5 miles from my house a triple murder of 3 young, wonderful students. So, this issue really hits home for me in that regard. And the Muslims I interact with really feel the burden of being Muslim in America in 2016. So we have to keep that into mind when we're thinking about these kinds of efforts and these kinds of programs. And that's a big challenge to overcome. The second challenge is concerns in Muslim American communities that are these efforts to outreach, to coordinate, to go into communities by police. Is this a subterfuge effort at surveillance? And it doesn't matter how many times people promise that or say it's not true, there is this innate suspicion that could be the case. Because there have been some examples of that in various contexts, and also because of a general fear and unfamiliarity, especially in recent immigrant communities who come from cultures where trust the law enforcement and police. If you came from a totalitarian country with a violent police force, that wasn't something that's in your DNA. Don't worry, the police are here to help you. The third big challenge is this notion of a double standard that is also deeply felt within at least pockets and parts of the Muslim American community, which is that they are being asked to take special efforts. They are having certain kinds of programs directed at them to deal with one element of the violent extremist problem, but other aspects of American society, whether it be white, rural, maybe African American, are not being required or put upon, or the burden is not being put on them to say, hey, work with your police to address these other forms of violent extremism. So there's a deep feeling of a double standard in that regard. Okay, so what are the promising practices? I know we're short of time and we have questions for everyone. The first question is, how do you establish trust given all these challenges? And what we found in talking to the police departments, that through our surveys, our site visits, our interviews with them, and interviews with the Muslim Americans in their communities, how do you establish trust is by the police going to the communities and asking how they could help them. How can police serve the interests of the community? It's kind of that simple. The idea that police are essentially, that these communities are constituents, they are a part of the public, that the police is there to serve, and the police need to go out and explain to them that that is what they're interested in doing. They're interested in serving their needs, and they would like them to tell them what are your needs so we can try to address them. And those can range from anything like preventing hate crimes, worries about mosque vandalism, bullying of children in schools, harassment of women in hijab, parking issues on Eid, safety around public buildings. Of course, we saw the 2 murders in New York of the imam leaving a mosque. So this community has a lot of public safety needs, not to mention all the ones that are attributable to any other community, whether it be drugs or gangs or crime, although the Muslim American community is pretty affluent, so some of these things are not as prevalent there. So there's a lot the police can do to build and establish a trusting relationship just based on working with their communities and identifying what their needs are. Second key practice, promising practice, or basic practice have to be done is that if you're going to do outreach and engagement with the communities, you have to divide that function from the intelligence and investigation function. You can't send people into mosques, into community meetings, sitting in people's homes, and then have them fill out incident reports that are filed with the FBI. I mean, that's just not going to work. So that's a big challenge for smaller departments that don't have the kind of resources to divide those. But you just can't have somebody driving from a community meeting to the Joint Terrorism Task Force. That's just not going to cut it. Does that mean that people who go out and are in communities and maybe somebody, they build trust and a family member, a mother or a father, as we saw with the New York pipe bombing, tells them, I'm worried about my son? Does that mean they can't pass that information on? No, of course they're going to pass. They're police officers. They have no choice. They're duty bound to do that, and the community has to know that information that they provide to them will be passed on, but they can't be intelligence gatherers. My final point on the best practices is that if a program is going to have outreach and say, we're coming to you, the Muslim American community, because we want help with this particular problem, you really need to do that for all the different communities in your jurisdiction. You can't just single out and say, well, we're just going to have a Muslim outreach problem because we want to deal with one form of violent extremism. It has to be seen as procedurally fair. I think we heard that before, non-discriminatory, and with recognition that, hey, there are all kinds of extremism, not just the one that is prevalent in the newspaper so often. If you want to look at our research on the Triangle Center on Terrorism and Homeland Security at Duke, we've got more recommendations that relate to training, provision of resources. The one other thing I want to, because this is a focus of a lot of efforts, the last thing communities really need to do is build intervention programs where individuals who are headed down the pathway to radicalization but have not committed crimes, have not committed violence, those programs need to be developed, hopefully in the community. They're a combination of mental health, social services, public health kinds of interventions that can be used to divert people and prevent them from essentially either committing violence or getting a 15-year sentence for material support for terrorism. That's what communities want to see. And if we can show success in that, it will have this feedback loop, because then the community will then trust and want to work with law enforcement more, because they want to see their young people essentially saved. What they don't want to see is people who could have been prevented from engaging in violence ending up in jail. So with that, thank you so much, and we'll turn it over for questions.